Hi, and welcome to the Ryle Books podcast, an archival space for the readings and conversations that we host in our bookshop and project space in Brussels. Today we have the pleasure of sharing the recording of a reading by Eugene Yiu Nam Cheung that took place on September 28th of this year. Eugene reads from his most recent publication, Bitterness and Wit, which was published by Asymmetry Art Foundation in London within the framework of Eugene Yiu Nam Cheung's curatorial fellowship at Whitechapel Gallery in 2023. The titular story in the collection, Bitterness and Wit, follows a museum worker who feels a profound sense of suffering as he vulgarises language to write jargon-filled wall texts for a contemporary art institution that he finds deeply unserious and unrigorous. Amongst other things, he questions the emancipatory valence given to language in certain schools of psychoanalysis, and poses questions to do with whether giving language and form to a series of symptoms can alleviate an experience of suffering tied to something so material and inescapable like the wage. The reading is followed by a conversation that I had with Eugene, in which we discuss his approach to writing fiction and art criticism, as well as unfold his thinking on practices of institutional critique. Eugene Yiu Nam Cheung is a writer, cultural worker, and founding editor of Decolonial Hacker. He is particularly interested in anarchist and dissident publication practices, utopian thresholds in language, and literary expressions of the revolutionary consciousness. In 2023, Eugene was the Asymmetry Curatorial Fellow at Whitechapel Gallery in London, where he curated the exhibition Anna Mendelssohn Speak, Poetess. Eugene has been a curator in residence at the Delphina Foundation and was previously part of the curatorial and public program teams at the Julia Stoschek Foundation and Documenta 15, respectively. His writing has appeared in places such as Efflux Criticism, Third Text, Art Review, Griffith Review, Art Plus Australia, and more. In 2021, he won the International Award for Art Criticism. He currently teaches critical theory and curatorial practice at the Design Academy in Eindhoven. Eugene holds degrees in art history, gender studies, and law from the University of Sydney. We hope you enjoy listening to this recording, and now we welcome Eugene.
Thank you. I'm going to set up a timer so I don't exceed my allotment. Thank you, Sven and Chloe, for hosting me in Brussels, and Ryle is an amazing space. I'm very thrilled to be here on this lovely, cold Sunday. I'm going to read from a work in progress first, and then move into Bitterness and Wit. This first piece is called Likeness, Beads of a Rosary. It sort of is meant to function as a text that holds the short stories in Bitterness and Wit together, and because it's turning into a book at the moment, this is sort of what I've been working on to think through the different threads, which we can tease out in the conversation. So, yeah. Of what is lost, irretrievably lost, all I wish to recover is the daily availability of my writing, lines capable of grasping me by the hair and lifting me up when I'm at the end of my strength, odes to the human and the divine. Let my writing be like the verses by Leopardi that Daniel Beeger recited on a Nordic bridge to gird himself with courage. Do not say, I am hungry. Say, who is starving me? Do not say, he's illiterate. Have you ever seen a poet's diploma? 1. Impressions that leave the perceptual field soon after entering it. A television broadcast of a boy cloaked in an emergency blanket, unable to speak. A flyer for a lost cat named Mimi taped onto a pole, torn in the center, on the corner of Rue Drolet and Saint-Denis. An elderly woman fumbling through her purse for a surgical mask outside a pharmacy. An argument between this woman and her son. Exasperated, she asks, why ask me about life and death when I can speak of living? 2. Scenes that remain and repeat endlessly, with little variation, which ought to be dead but are very much alive. In Berlin, an artist presents, quote, usable sculptures, unquote, to an enthusiastic public. Her objects, painful and debasing to render into language, but somewhere between a stroller and a prop for the Alien movie franchise, are periodically used by, quote, a group of baby-esque performers, unquote, or men in white singlets and scalloped diapers who contort themselves inside in an attempt to explicate, quote, the boundaries between free will and control, unquote. Those who revel in this charade, who admire this artist, lack any semblance of a complex interiority. The ever-growing infantilization of artistic production evinces the necessity to revive what Susan Sontag once advocated for, a culture of seriousness. Also in Berlin, an American with one of the largest cryptocurrency investments in the world, a British chef who owns a Hollywood catering business, and a lawyer in town to diversify the assets of his parents' trust fund meet for lunch. The investor speaks about empowering women through Web3. She declares, passionately, I'm setting up a coding school for girls in Afghanistan. The chef sighs with admiration. This is why we're friends. I'm so inspired by you. Having brought with him his own salt shaker in a plastic bag, the lawyer is preoccupied with seasoning his meal and pays little attention to this exchange. In the humdrum routine of personal experience, history did not matter. We were simply happy or unhappy, depending on the day. The more immersed we were in work and family, said to be reality, the greater was our sense of unreality. Private economies of grief and suffering wrested into public imagination, the contours of such lives shaped by fantasy. 3. I have never lived in a house with as many glass doors as I do now. The city I am in is so quiet that sometimes I find myself wishing to rattle or disturb the glass in some way so that it breaks. My partner who I lived with did not know this, that I've always feared my life as being inseparable from a penchant for petty violence. 4. In Athens, I noticed merchants with all their souvenirs and conviviality attempting to extract from our fetish for their culture's decay. As squawking Americans emerge from their fluorescent lit shops in flimsy laurel wreaths, wrestling one another with bags of junk and kitsch, the supposed magic of Greece wanes so much I can't help but think that our attraction to the classical is entirely artificial. If Athens invites us to marvel at what has existed for thousands of years, or, at least, since the Bavarian redux of the city following the end of Ottoman rule in 1832, its merchants persuade many into letting go in favor of something else. A parallel world where artifacts not made of marble or plastic, not made of stone or marble, but plastic and cheap paint, which might also outlive us all. They know it is no longer history or culture we are seeking, but the easier thing, narrative, spun around it. Plastic can be formed and smelted into tridents, crowns, and other obvious symbols. It is more didactic in its material cast than a Doric column. The story of Greece is not sold to us for its inherent humanity. Rather, narrative has become essential means for the merchant's survival. 5. If you cannot love your homeland as a human being, if the enemy pushes you out, love it like a plant. Stay, resist, or love it like a beast. Run, attack, or escape. But whatever you do, don't leave them your homeland. Pack it in your heart and take it with you wherever you go. A, who happens to be my father, was raised inside a lard factory, who then married B, my mother, who was a cop. I've always been self-conscious of this, of seeing my lineage as an extended piggery, though I am told that pigs are intelligent creatures, and if I identify with these creatures through the symbolism of their intelligence, I must, during our time together in this great piggery of the world, offer you some wisdom. Such wisdom can be no truer than this. Do not spend your life in search of the contradictions between life and death because you are living, and thus the nature of life should be to live like so. To ensure that others live in dignified conditions, that you do not make this world more humiliating than it already is, that you hold true to a conviction that you too are a pig, another sow that might one day be slaughtered. Run with this knowledge, but fear not the terror and horror of life. Go on living and see your desire for joy and pleasure as the joys and pleasures others wish to possess, those who are fighting against torsion and tyranny to attain this, and join them, fight with them, because only then will you understand what I mean when I say that all one can and must do is go on living. So that was the work in progress. To give you a little taste of the venom that I have for certain things. And I've got a bit of time, so I'm going to read Bitterness and Wit for you all. This is the first time I've read it aloud ever, so I'm not entirely sure how it's going to go, how it translates, but I hope you enjoy. Bitterness and Wit. The world functioned on terms that caused him great pain. He believed his life had amounted to nothing more than the accretion of learnt fantasies, and the conflation of such fantasies with happiness, which he understood now as an entirely false way to live. By the time he realized his life had been produced by the purgatory of study, matriculation, work forever, it felt too late to refuse the destiny laid out for him, which, in any case, did not relent in its onslaught onto what others called his soul, that metaphysical shadow he believed was an object of pure conjecture. That he was tormented by life was no proof in itself that he possessed a soul, though he found such a premise more substantive should it be considered a container or gauge for the reality of his circumstances. If the soul was indeed a container, it must have a limit as to how much suffering it can bear, and if he stayed close to monitoring it, he might grasp the absolute limits of this feeling, which he might then learn to tolerate. But his soul never overfilled with suffering in this revelatory manner, and it seemed tolerance expanded each time it neared its threshold. He lived in hope that such deep unhappiness would eventually become an ambient sensation in the vista of everyday life. He never liked describing the work which made him unhappy and suffer. The two, unhappiness and suffering, were functionally the same for him, beyond it involving looking after displays in a contemporary art museum. He refused identification with the term curator, despite his official designation as one, perhaps having his labour rendered so legible to an industry and profession he had so little respect for, exacerbated his spiritual discontents. He had little to do with the museum's programming, and even less of a hand in its acquisitions. Instead, he was tasked with the grunt work of writing interpretive materials, which would appear on neat white rectangles announcing some thing's supposed meaning and value. But as the curators above him showed no desire to lose their appetite for the fatuous, the writing he produced for them felt wholly debasing. Privately, he referred to his job as the codification of extreme stupidity. Dance, Dance for the End of the World is a video work by X that presents a speculative narrative around a fungal human entity capable of changing the biological makeup of the natural world through seemingly erratic but controlled movements. Through the interplay of bombastic visual effects, an original electronic score, and abstracted ballet choreography, X challenges the ways we understand human volition and the enormous yet undervalued role that fungi have in shaping the natural world and combating the climate catastrophe. Days writing such texts were days spent with the destruction of meaning. The author of these didactics, however diminutive within the economy of curatorial labour, was, in his belief, the most proximate to the public, and hence held the most important role in dispensing the museum's purported remit, to invigorate curiosity and intellectualism in civic life. But when presented with such absurd source material, day in and out, each sentence he wrote made only the fact of his circumstances clearer. The museum was a place where meaning was trickery, and to toil inside its hallowed and decrepit offices for minimum wage and a license to self-aggrandize was a condemnation of one's criticality. To the museum, he was an executioner of truth, tasked with enchanting language to give credence to artistic illusions. His work felt like a deception so profound he thought he couldn't bear it, and yet he did. And though he incessantly measured the volume of suffering he felt because of this, it was, rather, the heavy burden of his free will, however notional, which proved most tormenting, always whispering to him that there is a way out. A way out. Refusing to elucidate ill-informed artistic abstractions, taking a truncheon to his superiors' desks, setting the entire building on fire, all part and parcel of a dream to live untethered to this wage, a dream he was most prone to indulging as he sat alone in his cubicle, staring out of the mildewed window, through the copper-coloured maze of maple trees and into a world which so foolishly gave weight to this stronghold of charlatans. He felt the building shake as the walls around him caved in, the smell of melting silica and burnt wiring, liquefied oil paint and charred paper, the sensation of being crushed by layer upon layer of plaster and dirt, falling through the ceiling from his office down into the gallery where all the artists and curators were gathered and saw what was coming for them. He would make sure to stay alive long enough to revel in their horror. As he got up and walked towards the kitchenette to pour himself some water, past the other offices with all their doors left ajar, he realized he was there alone. He could have sworn the day had just begun. He had barely done any work, but his phone confirmed it was fast approaching 7, and it was likely that whilst imagining his little utopia, he had missed the exodus. He drank quickly and returned to his desk to throw on his overcoat, fumble through its pockets for a cigarette, tie the waistband, turn off the lights, and make his way home. As he rushed downstairs, he noticed a man standing just outside the glass doors, peering in, expectant, as if searching the foyer for some kind of object to study or signs that life was happening inside. And in a flash, our eyes met. I felt myself almost sprinting towards him, cigarette in mouth, imagining ways to change the impersonal quality of our silence. To ask for a lighter, to ward him away from this house of horrors, to take him past the maple trees and into a forest whose canopy of rippling emerald was surely from where his eyes derived their colour. As I stepped into the autumn evening, we stood for a second staring at one another, searching for recognition, until a smile dislodged the cigarette between my lips. He smirked as it fell to the ground. He was passing through from a country in the east, where war had erupted a few years ago, and today, while exploring this new city, in this district he had not yet ventured into, he was told by a stranger to visit the museum. I apologized that he had missed his opportunity, but it was open again tomorrow, unfortunately. He let out a hearty chuckle. Unfortunately, he repeated. What a strange word for a curator to use. And indeed, how unfortunate was it, he asked, with the war creeping westward, that this museum's existence was in jeopardy? I might be so lucky that its operations would cease by virtue of circumstances beyond its control. Who was this man, so brash to suggest that a military front could stop the torturous every day of the museum? In times of great crisis, curators quickly joined the war effort, turning the museum into a factory of motivational graphics and state slogans. Banners fly between ionic columns under the pretense of sustaining the morale of whoever looks in their direction, constructing the flimsy psychic conditions for resilience without ever opening their doors as shelter for the displaced. Where are you headed? I asked. If you've escaped a city under siege, that must signify a loss of your roots, of home. No, your assumptions are incorrect, he said. It seems you are asking me to labour perpetual mourning. He was, until recently, stationed in the medical corps of the Eastern Country, a psychiatrist whose practices with the mind became secondary to his skills in triage and the tourniquet. But after tending to so much blood, accompanied by so little conversation, and with no end to the war in sight, he realized he could no longer devote himself to the cause. Of what use was he on the front lines where it was impossible to exercise the full stretches of his mind and the acrobatics of his speech, his expertise wasted? So he left with plans to practice his craft all over, to find new patients, no, he corrects himself, people, who live in temporalities more conducive to communing with the psyche. After all, was it not his purpose to spread the good word of Freud? A voluntary exile to live out one's intellectual desire is not the same as losing one's home. The stranger who directed him to the museum recommended it for reasons that appealed to his sensibilities as a doctor with psychoanalytic leanings. She had mentioned a series of pen and ink drawings on display which caused her great distress each time she so much as imagined them, though they remained so beguiling she could not shake their place as fixtures in her interior life. She described the abstract figures contained within the drawings as a group of ringmasters leading one another through a sequence of death-inducing activities, diving into pits of fire, sawing off one another's limbs. He was so taken by these images that he decided to come see them for himself, to assess their violence. Nothing of this kind is on display, I said. The closest is a series of drawings depicting women having lunch outdoors during extreme weather events, an earthquake, a hurricane. According to the artist, the illustrations constitute a critique of feminine leisure. He smiled as if I had stepped into his trap. Yes, but suppose this is the artwork she's encountered. There remains significance to her seeing fire and the tools of torture. They speak to a more profound aberration in her psyche, because if a surface as inconsequential as a sheet of paper has brought this guillotine into existence inside her mind, such images warrant further examination. It is precisely for this reason that he too felt compelled to come and see the trigger of her pain, to later reveal it to her once again, through language, and connect these images to a larger sequence of painful events that have occurred in her life. I found only cruelty in his process. Who's to say that one's root causes of suffering should be another's cadaver to examine, particularly if the examiner is an itinerant doctor, unable to commit to seeing out the longevity of a person's repair? That he referred to this woman as a stranger when she was quite evidently the opposite might reveal the limits of his own ethical practice. He appeared undisturbed by my disgust, quipping in return that repair is an impossibility. His function is instead to give language to the experience of suffering. This talking cure, he continued, is a net woven between himself and his patients, thrown into the ocean of one's unconscious in the hope that it catches a repressed and edifying experience or memory. You seem to believe that finding the right language will offer your patients a way out of their grief, that talking is the greatest form of psychic amelioration. The fundamental axiom of psychoanalysis is to know thyself. My methods allow people to speak about their pain better, to establish dignity within their psyche. I want them to understand that there are no grounds for shame in psychoanalysis. They are free to communicate the ceaseless complexity of their minds in ways that ought never traverse into the realm of shame. Though, if they reside in such a place, it is my imperative to draw them out of it, to connect such feelings with their place of origin. Again, there is no repair, only a deeper understanding of one's own constitution. So, be talked out of one's own symptoms. In some ways, but not entirely. Well, riddle me this. How might language, as you conceive of it, lift me from my deep unhappiness within the museum? Tethered to the realities of a wage, the seemingly immovable condition of life, my survival hinges upon vulgarizing language for this factory of false ideas. Day after day, I use language to position artists and artworks I have little to no respect for as being of value for the human experience, telling visitors like yourself that such aesthetic gestures constitute a civic good. Night after night, as I step out of this place, so devoid of a connection to real life, no matter how much it purports to reflect it, I feel only the endless humiliation of living like this. I suffer not because I lack language to articulate my circumstances, but precisely because I have too much of it to describe the impossibility of my political desire. Surely, you understand the faults I am describing are entirely structural, but I am led to believe that they originate from within me. I do not write lies and frustrate the meaning of language out of passion. I do so I can eat. I've read Wittgenstein. I subject myself to this life because it is reality. It seems you might be living with a lot of shame. Have you ever thought of locating its provenance? Shame. You insist on imputing an inherent emancipatory potential in the act of speaking, to give form and legibility to agony with language. But to what end? Oh, you treat a woman's life as an intellectual curiosity, as if her pain could be transcended should she place it on the altar of syntax, as if you can understand a woman's darkest visions by visiting a museum whose artworks are merely a placeholder for wounds that you will never truly feel or know, as if the most elemental and complex forms of pain can be somehow anesthetized if made coherent within the greater arc of one's life. I tell you about precarity and you see shame. Tell me, doctor, who are your patients? I think it's instructive that you've mounted a defense on behalf of the woman and then quickly begun to question my class allegiances. Is there a point to your observation? What do you make of it? That you are unable to ask proper questions. Perhaps you are trying to reveal something, but I feel only hostility towards you. Ah, you see, it is impossible to outwit psychoanalysis. Who said anything about outwitting? I'm simply pointing out your inability to reckon with material realities. The grief and horror I feel is a product of quite simple economics, but you seem to believe that my agitation flows from an interior source. In other words, you remain unconvinced that everyday life is cause enough for my suffering. I think the two, interior life and material realities, might not be so disconnected. It might be wise to remember that resentment is a corrosive force. Oh, a corrosive force. Would that be so awful? To answer without so much as a beat of silence shows me that you might be too caught up in the velocity of your own ideology that you cannot bear to have it tested, and that you cannot bear to sit with my questions, to even meditate on the reasons as to why I've asked them, indicates to me that it would be difficult for anybody to work with you to capture the more intricate resonances of your fury. Now, if we're headed in the same direction, perhaps we can take a walk. The anatomy of a particular room. Nothing except a mountain of uncovered pillows stained in ancient hues of yellow and ochre, bleeding into shapes resembling clouds caught in afternoon light. The elongated shadow of an armchair made of dust. You are told to sit by someone you cannot see. You feel drawn to the gravity of their voice, which makes the experience of time feel sweet, dark, and lacquered, a sensation imbued with eternity, like molasses spilled by a god and never noticed, pouring down from the heavens and through the atmosphere, until it drips like a perennial accident onto the earth's surface. The voice is akin to the experience of being set alight. Again, you are corralled towards a mountain. Melting silica, burnt wiring, liquefied oil paint, charred paper, plaster, dirt. Thank you. That's a lot of talking, isn't it?
Thank you for this reading. Yeah, thank you also really for sharing the work in progress as well. It's exciting to imagine how the rest of the book is going to unfold and the different flavors of venom that appear. No, there's a sharpness, but also an incredible humor in it that I find very refreshing to listen to. I wanted to start by asking about your relation to and your approach to institutional critique. It's a bit of a large question to start with, right. But we can kind of specify it as we go along. I was thinking because you work in various positions in relation to like quote unquote art world, both as a curator within an institution, working in an independent publication platform of Decolonial Hacker, as an editor also, and then your own writing practice that is both, text like this, but also art reviews. And I'm wondering how, between these different positions, do you approach institutional critique differently? Does it make like different forms of thinking about the institution possible? And also if those different positions, if they change the kind of the efficacy of the critique, if you write as an independent writer, is that from a different mode of address than when you're writing as curator?
Wow, this is the first time I've been asked this. I think the different contexts do shape the writing and thinking differently. I think they're anchored to the same political impulse, of course. But when you work at an institution and you're expected to deliver a curatorial project, you can't, write like this as much as I would like to. But there are ways and strategies that I try to build in so that the political thrust of what you've just heard is apparent. I think that the potential of these things is something that I've never measured, insofar as that I think I've always just wanted to communicate like a deep unhappiness when I'm in these places. And also it's like an unhappiness of my own doing, in the sense that it's too late to retrain, or so it seems. And yet, I'm sort of stuck or, in this kind of inertia of working in an industry that I can see lacks a material relationship to life, particularly in institutional politics. A museological program about a certain political situation, for instance, say the genocide in Gaza, always sort of talks within terms of, in its own terms, rather than sort of reaching out and branching into something that's more material. That's sort of something that I've noticed in the last few years, particularly living in Germany, that like any sort of like gesture, however notional to a decolonial politics or an ethos, always just stays within this kind of abstraction. And it's impossible to do anything as a producer, as a curator, that sort of like more substantively like moves what you do in this place into life. And that's something that's perhaps irreconcilable, and that I've had to sort of just make peace with, in the sense that the form of the institution doesn't allow for the type of politics that I want to see possible. When it comes to Decolonial Hacker, that was originally an attempt to bridge these gaps. And for those who might not be familiar, it's an online publication that I run that operates through a web browser extension that you download for Google Chrome and Firefox. And if you go onto, say, a web page that I've commissioned a piece or an artwork to critique based on, I suppose, institutional problematics pertaining to pillaged objects, funding sources, labor conditions, then the website will then dissolve and you'll have the article in place of the homepage. It's a little sort of digital gesture to like sort of introduce critique into everyday life. But then very quickly I realized that the draw for people for Decolonial Hacker was this kind of like gossip mentality, this kind of like call outs and so on and so forth, wanting to know which director acted inappropriately at what function, like obviously like deranged, awful behavior, but not the function and purpose of what I'm trying to do with Decolonial Hacker, which is to try again to mirror like a more substantive, structural, civic politics rather than sort of individual cases of shame or shaming people. And so it's been a hard shift away from the call-out consensus to something that's a bit more poetic and rigorous. And our readership has dropped because of that. But I think that makes me feel a little bit better because it's like, operating in a frame of institutional critique, if one wants to call it that, in a way that feels more honest. And then the final part of the question about my independent writing is where I think I can be more expressive and be more free as to how I communicate these ideas, because I'm not bound to, say, any stricture or any form necessarily beyond language. And even that fails, but it's the experiment of doing so which I find, enlivening.
Yeah. No, I think you articulate something there of like also, this with Decolonial Hacker, this space between like a kind of interpersonal critique and individual responsibility, and then how to actually speak about structures that we are participating in, reinforcing, and at the same time negating and trying to undo.
Yeah, and art is an institution's the aperture through which we can learn more about how we operate on an individual, interpersonal level, obviously. It's the only reference point that I really have at this point in my life. I can't speak about, accounting or anything, another industry, this is to say. But, yeah.
No, I think it leads perfectly into my second question. When you were talking also around the potential that you have as a curator within an institution, and this kind of disjunct of like, okay, you're dealing all the time in Bitterness and Wit, you say a factory of false ideas, and this relation to like abstraction and like speaking back to the art world. And for me, a lot of the story of Bitterness and Wit revolves around this problem of language. And the question that you kind of pose is like, okay, can language actually change our material realities? Can it do that? And I think it's an interesting question specifically for a writer to propose. And the protagonist in the story, I think, has, through this conversation with the psychoanalyst, shows a genuine distrust in language, and a kind of like separation between the psychic space and material conditions of one's life. And I wondered if you agree with your protagonist, if you share that same distrust for language's capacity to transform material conditions. And if so, how does that problem work within your own writing? Like, how do you deal with that kind of almost contradiction of the form that you're working within, the distrust of the form you're working within?
That is a huge question. How to break that down? Maybe to begin, like the attack on psychoanalysis really came from a variety of sources, but I had a bone to pick with it last year, which I won't get into. But I took it as a kind of intellectual a form of inquiry, intellectual form of inquiry, that took language as a kind of emancipatory tool or a valence that has emancipatory valence inherently to it, that you can talk your way and rationalize and frame. And there are gaps and silences, of course, but the effort of giving form to something with language is the closest that we have to striking at the heart of some kind of elemental condition and so on. I think that I'm not sure if I can answer the question about language being emancipatory. I think that numerous examples in history have shown that it doesn't directly correlate to an emancipatory structure or an event, but it can produce the conditions for that. first person that comes to mind, obviously, is someone like Ingeborg Bachmann, the Austrian writer, who began as a poet and then moved into exhausted language in her poetry and then moved into fiction. And one thing that she always was mindful of was that her writing was trying to seek out the coordinates of making sense of fascism in Europe after the war. And so her fiction was always guided towards the ways in which men kill women through language, through, the figure of the psychoanalyst appears in a lot of her work as someone that is an object of derision or scorn, because she saw in the execution of psychoanalysis an inherently masculinist impulse. And that was one of the many ways that she saw women were killed by men. And that relationship with language was symmetrical with what she saw in fascism. So I think about someone like Bachmann, who was trying to use language to make sense of the structure and to guide readers in a more, say, poetic tense or register to think about how they embody everyday life. Whether or not that leads to something liberatory or emancipatory is, a kind of uncertain and ambivalent, to use a term from analysis. But I in my own work, I'm not trying to I don't have the delusion that, writing, a pamphlet or a series of short stories is going to actualize change, but perhaps it seeds something. I think that, we were speaking earlier about Ernst Bloch and the idea of utopia, and more particularly his idea of the not yet become, that within, a utopian naivety, which is not, it's not a pejorative to say that, but in that sort of utopian impulse of the not yet become, the thing that is yet to be, I think that's something that I carry with my writing. Perhaps that it creates the not yet become for someone, a curator, an art worker, a worker in general, to really contest the conditions in which they're dealt. But that's probably as far as I would claim my work is doing something.
Which is then, I guess that's the flip side of that problem, that actually then writing literature is then a space that actually can be separated from this material, that actually becomes its potential, that it is distinct from material reality or these conditions.
As in literature is distinct, you mean, or?
Yeah, literature or, also poetry, writing, that, with this idea of utopia or fantasy, they exist because they are separate from, or the potential of them is precisely that they can't, then there's no direct utilitarian correlation to our daily lives.
But then also when one writes, they're also bound by these conditions, right? So perhaps the thing that you create envisions at its best an alternate sort of non-utilitarian space. But when you're writing, you feel that material reality very strongly, sitting there and typing out however many thousand words, and it's a full-time job with what funding, who's funding it? Luckily this was attached to my fellowship in London. Shout out to the Asymmetry Art Foundation, who were very generous and trusting with letting me do this. But it was otherwise impossible. And in terms of your earlier question about art criticism, I've stopped writing reviews, really. I don't really do it unless it's something that I find necessary for myself to do. But I've wanted to do a form of art criticism or critique that takes on a more literary form for a long time, but there hasn't been the conditions for that. The industry is not set up in such a way that this is something that it gets commissioned all the time. These short stories are a form of art criticism for myself, but I needed that support, that sort of material reality, the money from someone else to do it.
I wondered if you could, there was a sentence in the work in progress. Uh-huh. We didn't talk about this before. This is a surprise question.
Great.
There was a sentence in that then I think relates back also to this question of this fantasy / material condition, or that dialectic that you say, so the sentence goes, they know it is no longer history or culture we are seeking, but the easier thing, narrative, spun around it. And then there's something else in between, and then you end the paragraph saying, narrative has become a central means for the merchant's survival. I wondered if you could unfold a little bit this idea around narrative that you're pointing to there. Also, I think in relation to what you just said around like art criticism and narrating the art object, or like this question of narration as an easier thing that's spun around history or culture.
Yeah, God. I think that it's not symmetrical, right? Like that fragment, that passage comes from an observation of Americans in Athens, sort of, acting in a kind of aberrant manner, and sort of seeing the way that they purchase and consume objects and, the regalia of ancient Greece and so on and so forth, completely unaware that like what they know as ancient Greece was built by the Germans. That's another thing. But I guess mapping that onto art writing, I haven't really thought about it in those terms. But if I was to like have a go, how would I have a go? I think that perhaps the central impulse to that is that it's easier to sell a fiction. And as trite and as easy as that sounds, I think that and this is something that I think about a lot as a curator, is that like, the narrative that someone gets from a show, or the narrative that someone is able to then regurgitate or reproduce when someone asks them about what they saw, is such like a central seductive mechanism that gets people through the door to see work. And so there's this kind of like function with language in sort of not just watching the Americans, but also watching like how culture is consumed, that like you need not so much a soundbite, but you need like a hook, and you need something that's like very neat and packaged and so on and so forth. And when you're giving like a walkthrough as a curator, like you have these easy sentences. A few curators in the room, perhaps like you could back me up. Like it's a few sentences and like points that like aha, like people really respond well to this. Or like I'm giving a tour to a collector and they really like to know like this banal fact about this artist, because they can then spin it as something quirky if they want to like collect the work, whatever. So like this kind of the ease at which narrative becomes a packaging or a or like an apparatus through which culture or like the meaning of or the history of something is lost, is perhaps the relationship between the two. I wasn't thinking about curating or art when I was writing that fragment, but I suppose that now when I sort of do this explication, there is a correlation. But that was that's as best as I can do at the moment.
Thank you for attempting that. No, because also in Bitterness and Wit, then I mean the conversation with the psychoanalyst, the work that the psychoanalyst has come to see, like the way he's describing it doesn't actually match what is on show in the exhibition. Like it's also been like misnarrated in a way, but that still has produced a desire to come and see this thing which actually like doesn't exist in the gallery, but there will be something that will kind of fulfill the promise of the narrative that was described.
Yeah, maybe as well, when I said before that I had a bone to pick with psychoanalysis, like I really made this psychoanalyst like a bad psychoanalyst. Like this is not how like a good psychoanalyst would like conduct themselves. Like they don't go and like see an artwork that their patient has like told them, but that's just like not good practice. But like I was deliberately making him a very grotesque figure for whatever reason that will remain a mystery to you. But I think that I think that I can't look past the fact that he's like very highly constructed and stylized. I think that goes back to like him as being a cipher of language, or like a cipher for an intellectual inquiry that centers language as something that is like inherently emancipatory. And so I wanted to make that as like ugly as possible. And I guess that's a formal decision, a compositional thing, rather than
No, that's good. Okay, last question, and then if there's any questions on that side of the room, we can also hand over. I wanted to ask about your relation to autofiction. I know. I mean, I think it has been. It's a term that feels like it's very quickly losing meaning. It's being applied to a lot of writing in various places. And we had a conversation a while back when we first met around autofiction. And we were like, we were thinking about it as like, what is the difference of thinking autofiction as a genre and what is it as a method, like as a way of approaching writing? And I wonder if you could share your thoughts on autofiction and your relation to the personal in your own writing practice. Like, is there a certain kind of refusal of the autofiction, both methodologically and in terms of genre, or I don't know?
I am not writing autofiction. Is this being recorded? I am not writing autofiction. Look, so in terms of this publication, I think that it would be very easy to frame it within those terms, but I think that I would trouble that in the sense that, as I was saying before, this is really an attempt to create a form of art criticism that is held by something that's literary. You know, how the guiding question for this was, how do you write criticism, art criticism that decenters an art object and looks at the structure and does so not through an essay but a story? And so I think that what could be read as autofiction there is the fact that I'm drawing from obviously experiences of my life and forming that into a fictional composition and so on and so forth. But whether or not that methodology like falls squarely within autofiction, I cannot say. Maybe that's up for you to decide. But I would say that I'm not writing autofiction. I think I'm doing something a little bit more serious and structural in that regard. But it's an attempt. It really is like a first attempt at that. And so perhaps as the book develops, maybe I'll be like, oh fuck, I'm writing autofiction. But at this point, I don't think I'm writing autofiction. I think that it's trying to like move the form of art criticism in a more literary direction. And so perhaps in terms of genre, it fits more in that than autofiction. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts they would like to share?
You can also hate it. That'd be nice.
Yeah, any critique is welcome.
I love critique. Yeah.
Right, I still serve in a specific market because I know that notice that you move in a specific world, and also your the persons you create in the application is now in your the first word you talked about. It's still the themes of the art world and art criticism, and even the heroes you constructed, the psychologist, is the view out of the book from art criticism. And so my question is, do you target this market on purpose because this is your who will write in the future, or do you have this in mind to start there and then turn it around?
I think the latter. I think that, as I was saying, the only thing that I really know at this point in my life is the art world. And it's both a limitation as well as a side of like immense material. I think that the art world obviously has the same mechanics as like the real world. That's an obvious fact. But in terms of the people or the characters that I fabulate, for now they have to be drawn from this because I know these people forensically. But eventually I would want to write more about people who aren't in the art world necessarily. The other two stories in Bitterness and Wit do not touch the art world at all, and that's perhaps gesturing to that possibility. And on the question of market, perhaps art people will be interested. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure what the reception is going to be. They might hate it. They might feel attacked. They might love it because they might see themselves reflected. I don't know. But also, like when you write a work, you put it out, you can't control it. And I think that's maybe like the cosmic joke of being a critic now moving into fiction is that there will be critics who will find problems with this, either in form, content, or structure, or all three. And I just have to live with it. So in terms of the market, maybe the art audience is like a more generous audience to start with because critique is maybe a little bit less prevalent in that world. But we'll see. I'm not sure.
Why not frame it as a novel? It just came up recently, like thinking about how to deal with this thing of like being the art world actually writing and what that framing like serves. And I remember having a conversation with like an author that was also sort of saying like it was kind of difficult because I'm actually
Why not a novel? Is that the question? Yeah. I guess it's a question of anxiety because this is like the first attempt at writing fiction. Like what I've done is like criticism and essays and a bit more sort of like straightforward didactic writing until now. And I don't think I have the requisite skills yet in myself or confidence to write a novel. That's the honest answer. But I also think formally, a series of short stories perhaps fits more within the kind of like political a direction of where I'm taking this. Like the title of the work in progress is Likeness, Beads of a Rosary. Beads of a Rosary is taken from Walter Benjamin's idea that history cannot be mapped or sequenced like beads of a rosary. And it's also written in fragments and so on. I think that what I want to communicate is this kind of discontinuous form of time and the experience of that in the art world, because the stories that will come out won't be all in the art world. Half of them will be notionally art world. They'll be taken from the characters from this industry, but then the other half are set within the domestic interior. So it's setting up this correlation between life within, an intimate space that is like legible as private, and then one that is more public, but is also private, which is the art world. And I think that, so it was a formal decision as well from here on in to just do short stories that cohere as a whole. Perhaps there is a novel somewhere in the future, but I don't feel ready for that. I'm still working it out.
I'd be interested to hear you situate yourself and this effort maybe among your peers. You mentioned like some 20th century figures in the European context, but I'd be curious if you see yourself among peers who are also making these attempts. I mean, Ivan's book is sitting up there. I don't know if you feel any relation to his work or maybe other writers. In your context.
In my immediate context, you mean, or like just...
I've heard you sort of situate yourself among 20th century
Yeah.
But I feel like there is a big lacuna in trying to articulate art. On the one hand, in the face of appalling censorship politically. On the other hand, in terms of the asphyxiation of professional norms and art jargon. So I feel like you're encountering a serious impasse that probably many are encountering. And I wonder if you see others in your context also making escape attempts. Maybe they're very different to your own escape attempts. I'm curious if you have a reflection on that.
Yeah, there's Travis Yepperson, the writer, wrote his PhD thesis on art criticism as a literary form, and he cites people like Estelle Hoy as, like doing that, which I don't necessarily resonate with, but I think that, he's someone that has spent a dedicated amount of time, a scholarly effort nonetheless, to work out how the form of art criticism can do something that is literary and therefore more imbricated with a material reality or a material sort of impulse. So that was very formative. I'm very lucky to have friends around me that I situate myself within as well. Sanja Grosdanic and Bassem Saad, who's in this room, are two incredible writers that I look up to immensely in the way that they think about the sort of the enduring nature of historical violence through film and essays and any other cultural form is something that I see as a very diligent and trenchant effort that I want to also aspire towards. And I think that that's like something that I'm very sincere about. I love my friends deeply. I respect them deeply. And so the immediate milieu that I have is also one that makes that propulsion, this effort possible. Yeah.
Because it's in the art world, you always start with the philosophical concept, like also what you said about there's a lot of quoting, and when I hear this, it's immediately the intellectualization of emotions, and I think like, where are real emotions? Where is it? Because when you talk about political situations, they clash with emotions that the systems put under the carpet, that they normalize. I said, like, how do you deal with it? How do you, or will you?
Is intellectualizing emotion necessarily a bad thing? I think I would disagree. I think that, it's opposite for the contradiction between like an emotional and an intellectual impulse to exist, but the contradiction is the beginning of complexity. That's where you can think through it. You can think about and intellectualize a feeling through, Benjamin, who was also trying to situate emotions and feelings through a felt materiality.
Intellectualization means that you don't give space for certain emotions. That's why I'm against this intellectualization as a soul. You mentioned something else.
I think you can feel an emotion. It sounds like, maybe you're gesturing towards this idea that like one needs to embody and feel and be affected by the thing, which is sure, fine. But I also think to like make sense of that and to put how you feel within the context of a larger system and society. Like, I'm of the belief that no one's life is inherently interesting in and of itself. I think that what makes that life interesting is how it is contextualized within a larger struggle or a history. And perhaps that's the impasse in which like this is, right? Because I believe that you can have the experience of an emotion, but you can also at the same time think intellectually about where that emotion might arise from and how it is exacerbated or diluted by a series of historical factors which are pressurizing you. And I don't think those things are necessarily incompatible. Sure, they might feel contradictory, but again, that's where complexity begins. Complexity in writing, for sure.
Trauma has been experienced in the body, what is memorized in the body. We come, for example, from the dance theory. There's the dancing brain because there are different connections within the cerebrum. And you cut out, you leave out. And if I'm mega radical, then I say this is the same as fascism. That you only give space for this and you cut out the rest.
I think no. No, it's an interesting provocation because, from my understanding, fascism was utilized and operated through the commodification of emotion rather than intellect. The great seduction of German fascism was that it appealed to the masses through the belief that they could enact state power. They got the eros and the I guess the seduction of being able to exercise state violence on sort of their individual level, and that sort of made them more attached to like this emotional romantic belief that they were part of a larger system that was moving towards them also operating with like the state.
What they also did is they wiped out of language certain words for emotions because these words didn't exist anymore. The emotion didn't exist anymore. So if the people certain, that is the naughty part of fascism, that they rewrite language.
That would be a different book. Perhaps there will be an affect theory critique of my work, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with Sarah Ahmed coming for me. That's okay. That's fine.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Eugene, and thank you everyone for your rich and exciting questions. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Ryle Books podcast. This episode was edited by Ros Del Olmo. You can find more of our past and upcoming events on our website, www.ryle.space.